It covers what else do you know to what else do you know arc. The first, what else do you know? Um, well, the first, what else do you know, starts with a pilot project that we started in China in about 1995. My first trip to the People's Republic of China was in 1995. We wanted to know who our counterparty was. I'll go ahead. This was our first uh, pilot project in China. Ken Collier is one of the finest welders I've ever met. One of the finest people I've ever met. He died a few years ago, so I miss him greatly. But the machine in the background is a natural gas processing machine or processing plant that we built in Bryan College Station and shipped all the way across the Pacific Ocean and into far western China. So it's halfway around the northern hemisphere from Texas. We wanted to know who our counterparty was. In China, we learned that our counterparty was ABC Company. There's not a Dun and Bradstreet in China, so I went to the CIA and said, this is who we hear our counterparty is. Is that the truth? And the CIA said, well, yeah, that's the truth. So with my youthful, naive confidence in our legendary capabilities of the CIA, I merrily get back on the airplanes and fly halfway around the northern hemisphere and find out that no, ABC Company was only half of our counterparty. The Communist Party of China, which I call the CPC, was the other half. So when I came back home to Texas, I landed and I called the CIA, and I was probably a bit irreverent. I don't think I said you lied to me, but I'm sure the tone of my voice said you didn't tell me the full truth. And at the end of the conversation, the CIA officer on the other end of the line said, well, what else do you know? I'll get to the second, what else do you know later. As Marianne mentioned, I spend a lot of time in Washington these days. And when I'm talking to people in Washington, they often want a bluff, a bottom line up front. So the bottom line up front right now is that the CPC, and I call it the CPC, the Communist Party of China, because that's the legally correct term. A lot of people use CCP instead of CPC. So forgive me for insisting on correctness. It's actually kind of easy to get it right. But the Communist Party is eating our lunch, and they're eating it out of our lunch pail. And if we think that's bad, the people in China suffer most and worst from what the Communist Party does to people around the world. And then we can talk a little bit later about how the Communist Party got back around to treating people poorly. Mao treated people really badly. Deng Xiaoping treated them less badly. And now Xi Jinping is treating them badly again. So the reason why I'm going to Washington is that our company sued China's biggest defense contractor called AVIC, the Aviation Industry Corporation of China. They also build helicopters. Who's my helicopter lady? There you are. They also build helicopters. And in fact, they contracted for an engine or engines for a helicopter that was going to carry a lot of people around. They contracted with Pratt & Whitney. Pratt & Whitney designed a jet engine. Then each helicopter was going to have two engines. And when Pratt & Whitney went back to China to see the helicopter that the new engines were going to go in, rather than a 24-seat helicopter, it was a 2-seater, but it still weighed the same. Why did it weigh the same? Say again? Weaponized. It was a military aircraft. It was a military helicopter that AVIC, the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, had not told them about. So we sued that company. We collected dollars in Dallas. We bankrupted a subordinate unit, and we disrupted leadership within AVIC. And at the time, if you're the biggest defense contractor in China and the sole supplier of military aircraft, your leadership is very close to the Communist Party, if not very high ranking in it. So and AVIC is the sole supplier of military aircraft. Here comes the other, what else do you know? After we beat AVIC in litigation that went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, the U.S. Air Force found us and said, what else do you know? So that's the arc of the book. And now with people in D.C., I say, you people in D.C., and I get frustrated with government. My background is commercial always, and I'm used to quicker decision cycles and action cycles. But in DC, I try to tell people, use the lessons that we learned from dealing with the Communist Party of China, because the CPC reserves the right to make every decision it wants in China. And that's regardless of tense. Past tense, current tense, future tense. The Communist Party can change a decision that we made several years ago if they want to. So with Dancing with the Dragon and my talking to people in Washington, I want them to focus on the two areas that we as Americans can do something about. We need to play to our strengths and play against the Communist Party's weaknesses. Those two areas are access to capital and the appearance of legitimacy. We can attenuate the Communist Party's ability to do bad things to people by going after their cash and going after their appearance of legitimacy. That's King Collier. Again, another quick reason to have this slide in the natural gas processing plant that's in the picture. Our IP, our intellectual property, the intellectual property that we had to protect, is in the skid. Do y'all know what I mean by the skid? You know, the bottom of the plant. That's where we put the heat exchanger. So for a natural gas processing plant to work, you have to have really good heat exchangers. Ours were really good, and Ken knew how to weld them. So we put them in the skid. We filled the skid with insulation around them, and then we welded the top and the bottom so you can't get to our intellectual property that we had to protect without first taking the natural gas processing plant that was making the Communist Party money out of service and getting a welding torch and cutting through it. Once you saw what the heat exchangers looked like, you would still have the challenge of how do you build it. So that's a few points on that. I told you about the litigation. Sorry about the chart. It's a little busy for some people, but 3 points of it. The flat line, the orange line, it represents AVIC, the big defense contractor, strategic acquisition of aviation assets in the United States. Our litigation flatlined AVIC's strategic acquisitions of aviation assets in the United States. The blue line shows AVIC's strategic acquisitions of aviation assets in the rest of the world. So we flatlined it. The gold brick on the right represents our collecting dollars in Dallas in April 2022. That flat line is a national security interest. The gold brick is a commercial interest. So we've shown how the United States can tie national security interests and commercial interests together. There are a lot of folks in Washington that say, that talk disparagingly about businesses, and they say, well, businesses are just concerned about quarterly profits. Well, 2 points about that. First, if you're going to win a marathon, you've got to run mile times. Your mile splits have to be fast enough. If you run your first mile split in 6 minutes, you've lost the marathon. So quarterly reports are like mile splits for for marathoners. The second thing that it really bothers me about the attitude of folks in Washington, D.C., is that they think that businesses' concerns about profits just represent greed. Maybe certainly there is some greed in that, but that's mostly competitiveness. And if we don't have companies in the United States that can help generate returns on investment, we don't have an economy that survives that prospers. And if we don't have an economy that prospers, we cannot defeat the Communist Party's objectives of doing bad things to people all over the world. Another topic that's important to think about in China is face. Y'all may not recognize me, but I'm the guy on the lead camel. What's wrong with this picture? I'll ask you in just a second, but I'll tell you a key is that the guy in the middle was Deng Xiaoping's advisor on jet engines and rockets. So everybody remembers Mao, who started the Communist Party in the early 1920s, and then died in the mid 70s. Deng Xiaoping was the guy that came along after him of significance. There were few people in between, and now the most important the current paramount leader of the Communist Party is Xi Jinping. So just talk about those three paramount leaders briefly. Mao said the legitimacy of the Communist Party comes from the barrel of a gun. So when you were there right after he died, Deng Xiaoping was rising, and Deng said, holster the pistol or holster the gun and start tying the legitimacy of the Communist Party to how the Communist Party raises the standard of living of Chinese people. Now, Xi Jinping has come back along and he said, we're going back to the gun. He's losing it on economic measures. So he is having to go back to the barrel of a gun. That's what makes the Communist Party so awful and dangerous today. So the guy on the second camel was Deng Xiaoping's advisor on jet engines and rockets. And what's wrong with that picture? Well, I'm not Chinese, and in a Confucian sense of hierarchy, you'd rather be Chinese than anything else. So that's one strike against me where I should be subordinate. Another is that Mr. Joe is older than I am, so he's superior for at least two reasons. He's also, in effect, a uniformed officer of the PLA because of his relationship through AVIC to the People's Liberation Army. So here I am, I'm on the lead camel, the bigger camel, and that's a bad place for me to be. What made it worse is, growing up in Texas, I'm not too uncomfortable riding a horse. And as a camel lurches up to its standing position from when you get on it when it's kneeling, I'm fairly comfortable. I looked back in my comfort and saw Mr. Joe white knuckling his pommel. I saw fear in his eyes. He did not like that. And you can see the shadows. There were witnesses. There were people that I saw his fear. Anyway, he got back at me. That night, he invited me to play a pool game called Snookers. And what you don't see in this picture that he gave me is that he's on the other side of the table, and behind him, lined up against the wall, are all his lieutenants watching him kick my fanny around the pool table. Well, it worked. There's Mr. Joe on the right and me on the left. And we wound up signing a joint venture agreement where we brought a GE jet engine to the western end of the Great Wall, put it on the ground, and put a generator behind it, fueled it with natural gas. A lot of y'all are familiar with this technology here, I'm sure. And the jet engine turns really fast. The generator turns really fast, so you spit out a whole lot of electricity. It was great. The guy in the middle was one of the smartest, most capable, hardest working, honest people that I've ever worked with anywhere, Mr. Jiang. After we built the power plant, Jiang went on to become one of the highest ranking Communist Party members in all of China. And he was the head or co-head of SASAC, the State-Owned Asset Administration and Supervision Administration Commission. He was a threat to Xi Jinping just because he was capable. Xi Jinping had him disappeared. So I have not been able to get to this guy in about 15 years or about 12 years. If you're with changes that we had to face, some were geopolitical, some were just financial. We had to pivot several times. One example of having to pivot is I was in Beijing on April 1st. It was March 31st here when warplanes collided. A Chinese fighter, I think it was an F-1, bumped our EP-3, our naval reconnaissance airplane. Our EP-3 landed in Hainan Island. The Communist Party or the PLA airplane crashed in the ocean, and it's kind of silly, but it amuses me that the pilot of the Chinese company of the Chinese plane was named Wang Wei. Sad for him and his family, but that geopolitical event is an act of war, and acts of war destroy commercial finance. And here we're building power plants in China, trying to make them that work on a commercial basis, requiring lots of capital that comes in through project finance. Project finance and acts of war repel one another. That day, we actually went to lunch early because we had a big day planned for finance and operations, all kinds of things. But we knew that with the warplanes colliding, that the rest of our day was not going to be very productive. So we went to lunch early and started drinking beer. By the end of the lunch, we had decided AVIC, they're the biggest defense contractor in the world. You know how to make plane or wings for airplanes. You know how to make propellers for airplane engines. You know how to make helicopter blades. Can't you make blades for wind turbines? And we all thought, in our beer-induced wisdom, that would be a great idea. That was 2001. By the end of the year, we had started a blade company, a company to make blades for wind turbines. Every time we changed our business plan, we became more important to the Communist Party. We also elevated our importance to them because we were making them money. We grew the blade company from making 600 kilowatt wind turbine blades to making 1.5 megawatt wind turbine blades. We grew it starting in 2001 from nothing to $350 million in revenue by 2007 or 8. And we were going to take that company public in China. The blades got bigger, the revenue got bigger. The public offering in China was going to be for $1.8 billion. We started a company here in Texas to develop wind farms so that we could go back to GE and say, GE, we're building a wind farm in Nebraska. It's going to need about $100 million worth of wind turbines. Would you like to bid? And even GE will bid on a $100 million order. And we said, and in your bid, we want you to include our wind blades, the wind blades that we make in China, on your gear that we're going to put on our wind farm in Nebraska. And that was working really well. AVIC decided it wanted to be, that's the biggest defense contractor, wanted to be a partner with us in the wind farm development company in Texas. And we said, thank you. We appreciate your proposal. We appreciate your expression of interest, but you can't use tax credits in the United States. You can't keep up with the commercial cycles in the United States, and you don't understand ownership in the United States. For a Communist Party member to think that we had to talk to a ranch owner or a farm owner or a ranch family and say, we want to use your land to build a wind farm but we're going to use your wind. The Communist Party doesn't think that anybody can own land, much less own rights to the wind that pass over the land. They came back and said, well, we'd like to invest 600 million bucks. So what did I say? Okay, but we're going to have dispute resolution in Dallas, Texas. Now we expected them to say no, it's got to be Delaware or someplace else, but that just passed. We also knew uh, how to make sure we worked the negotiation to where we kept that quiet, and essentially that was saying we're going to give you a great deal. We're going to give you 20% of the company for your 600 million bucks. You're going to get all your money back first, and you're going to get a preferred return on your money, and then you're going to own 20%. We knew that they would not be happy with anything less than 50%. So we started them at 20, which was within view of 50%. And as we got closer to getting a deal signed, protecting our dispute resolution provision, we let them have 50%. So if you're going to work with the Communist Party, you've got to be prepared to go to war with them. And that's exactly what we did. We wanted to work with them because $600 million is a lot of money. You can grow a lot of businesses that way. But we also knew that we needed to prepare to be in a fight with them. We thought that having dispute resolution in Dallas, Texas would be enough to keep them from wanting to fight us. Along the way, they hired our general manager, they diverted financing, and they even stole a wind farm from us. And we could talk about that a long time, but that's what led to the litigation. It got really ugly. This is the chairman of AVIC in about 2015, Chairman Lien Zhuoming. We were about to go into litigation, and they had stolen money from us in China. One of AVIC's subordinate units had taken $8 million from our joint venture company in China. We were looking at financial statements from one period to the next, and we thought, something's wrong. There's $8 million missing. Where did this $8 million go? We thought it was an inventory issue, an accounting issue. We couldn't figure it out. Finally, we found out, no, one of AVIC's subsidiaries had stolen $8 million. We said, oh, okay, well, that's fine. AVIC, you can put the money back. In 2023, AVIC had $150 billion in revenue, more revenue, that's an approximate number, more revenue than any other defense contractor in the world. So we said, okay, AVIC, you've got enough money, you can put it back. And they initially said, okay, yeah, we will. Well, they didn't. So not knowing when to shut up, I said, well, you said you were going to do it, and you didn't put the money back. And then we got a letter from AVIC, the parent, saying if our joint venture is going to pay a dividend to one shareholder, it should pay a dividend to all shareholders. Well, that was just a made up bunch of hooky. They had stolen the money, and they were telling us they're not going to put it back. So I was a little bit brash in my comments. And what happened next? We got a bill, a tax bill for the amount of money that had been stolen. So they taxed us. The Communist Party taxed us for the amount of money that they had stolen. So I wrote Chairman Lien a letter saying, Dear Chairman Lien, you'll be shocked to know that we found corruption in your outfit. The letter's actually in the appendix to the book, so you can read it. It alternates Chinese and English paragraphs. It goes about 5 pages or so. It compares the corruption that AVIC had allowed in its shop to the corruption that the Communist Party accused Bo Xilai. Bo Xilai was in competition to be the current paramount leader with Xi Jinping. So the amount of corruption that AVIC had been involved with was 10 times what was publicly alleged that Bo Xilai had been. We delivered the letter when CCDI is the Central Commission for Discipline and Inspection. We delivered the letter to Chairman Lien. when we knew they were there. We sent it by email. We sent it by fax. We sent it by snail mail. We sent it by DHL, and we delivered it by hand. So we know CCDI got the letter. 6 months later, 6 months later, Chairman Lean was disappeared. Now, I'm not taking credit for disappearing him myself, but we sure didn't give him a tether to pull him back from the precipice. And if anything, we were at least a butterfly's breath on the back of on his back to send him over the precipice. I'm going to end right quick to answer your questions, because I learned more from your questions. I know a lot of you all have been to China and have had relationships with China, know more than I do, have experiences that I don't have. So I want to learn from you. But real quick, the book came out on October 1st, 2024. Familiar date, the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. How can you tell it's an imperial dragon? Anybody know that that's an imperial dragon? 5 toes. The 5 toes say this book is for the imperial power in China today. So it's going head on at the Communist Party. And then in the upper right corner, Jim Haynes and Pat Walsh wrote the foreword, which is a way of saying Jim Haynes, former general counsel to the Department of Defense, and Pat Walsh, former admiral in charge of the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and retired as the vice chairman of naval operations, are aware of what's going on and care. Why don't we stop there, Ronan?
Yeah, that was great, Patrick. And you probably already saw it outside, but we have Patrick's great book outside, and he'll be signing them afterwards. I definitely recommend getting it. And my colleagues, we have these blue question cards for any of you. If you want to ask any questions, and we'll pass them up and read them to you. And maybe just to kind of set the table as they collect some of the audience questions. You have a long, deep years of experience in China, going back to the 90s. You've seen everything from the end of Deng Xiaoping to Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and then, of course, the current president, President Xi. Was it a very big, noticeable difference as doing business at a high level in China once President Xi came into power? And do you think, a lot of people say, was this what was always going to happen, or something could have been different if Xi hadn't become, the president of China?
Sorry, Ronan, I'm going to pick on you first.
Sure.
Don't call him president, because he's not a president. There's nowhere where the general secretary of the Communist Party or the chairman of the Central Military Commission, he's not a president anywhere. So it's worth making the point. It's easy. I appreciate that. But anyway, your question's a good one. So Xi Jinping did change the trajectory of China by changing the importance that the Communist Party puts on how people in the Communist Party get recognized. So the first we saw that was as Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai especially were competing. We saw Communist Party members on the board of directors freeze. It used to be that we could make a decision. We're going to hire a new marketing officer. We're going to hire a new chief engineer. We could make that decision quickly. We reviewed their credentials and decided yes or no. It turned out we couldn't even make a hiring decision because they were afraid. They were afraid to contradict somebody's opinion that they didn't know who they should care about. It's always hard to say how it would have been different, but if Bo Xilai would have become the chairman of the Central Military Committee or the general secretary of the Communist Party, it would have been different. How would it have been different? I'm not sure. I suspect that Bo Xilai was much more commercially oriented and would have expected to to tie the party's legitimacy, as Deng did, to raising the standards of living of Chinese people. But it's impossible to know.
And just to follow up on that, Beaujolais, for a lot of people, they know him once those big corruption trials came out. Most people would say whatever he may or may have done, the corruption. Do you think that was probably legitimate? That they might have escalated the case, but that he was corrupt, and there's corruption at all different levels.
Even Xi Jinping got into the Communist Party through a wee bit of corruption. To get admitted, he brought his boss a fried egg and a steamed bun when that was a luxury. So, Xi Jinping has been involved in corruption. His family's been involved in corruption. What really changed the trajectory of who was going to win, Beau's wife, Gu Kai Lai, actually killed a British businessman, poisoned him. So, I mean, for the general secretary's wife to have been a murderess would have been really awkward for the Communist Party.
And some of these have names and some don't. Again, you guys don't have to put a name on if you want, but someone asked a good question. Why did you not end up getting arrested for all of your efforts? And were you, I suppose, were you seen as helping China compete with the United States? And I suppose, how did the U.S. government kind of see your efforts?
That's a fantastic question. Lots of nuances to that. First, they tried to arrest me. In our little litigation, I didn't tell you that they sued me personally for $300 million. That was a bit awkward to deal with. But they also tried to get two detectives in California, Fullerton County detective, and I can't remember the other county in California, but they accused me of recording a conversation of a Communist Party member improperly. Well, I did record the conversation, but it was in a coffee shop in a hotel in California that AVIC owned. So in California law, that was plenty legal. But the Communist Party sponsored the criminal accusations against me and tried to get California law enforcement to arrest me. The way I dodged that one, I had become quite familiar with, or the FBI and I had become quite familiar, CIA as well. But I called what I called my guardian angel in the FBI and said, I need help. These two detectives in California, Pomona County was the other one, Fullerton and Pomona County, want to arrest me for the criminal activity, what they call the criminal activity of recording a conversation. And the FBI can't tell the detectives what to do. So she calls the detectives and says, hey, this is senior special agent in Dallas for the FBI, and I've got this guy, Jenevein, that's given me all kinds of really great information. And I see you've got a criminal case pending against him. What's up? Is this guy a good guy or not? And immediately both of them dropped the charges against me. At the same time, the Communist Party was trying to get me to come back to China. And I had said for years, look, we have 4 board meetings every year. Let's plan a year ahead so I can get my plane ticket, because they weren't reimbursing me for my plane ticket. So I'd say, pay, so I can get a cheaper ticket, or else you need to start paying for the plane ticket. So, well, we're not going to do either one. We're not going to plan sooner, and we're not going to buy your ticket. So they asked me to come back, and I said, I'm tired of doing this. I'm not going to pay for my own plane ticket. I'm not coming unless you pay. They said, no, we're not going to pay. Then they called back and said, we'll pay. We'll pay for your plane ticket. And I said, well, I fly business class. Oh, we're not going to pay business class. And they hung up on me. And then they called back and said, we'll pay your business class. So they tried. And I eventually said, I'm not sure I can get a visa to come back to China, because China doesn't allow criminals into the country, and the Communist Party is accusing me of being a criminal, so I'm not coming.
Okay. Well, I think you're wise. You might not be here right now, I think, if you had been. But just at the second half of that person's question, um, not just you, but maybe American companies in general, especially before things kind of turned south, were there any who saw you as helping China compete against the United States? And what was the U.S.'s government's perspective on American companies being so involved in China and even perhaps unwillingly, perhaps exposing their trade secrets, intellectual espionage? What was the role of the United States government, and did it kind of gradually kind of wake up?
The role of the United States government was rhetorical only. They did absolutely nothing to help us. I told you in the first one of the first slides about our protecting our intellectual property. We were assiduous in protecting our intellectual property, and when I was talking to other companies, I always told them, "Fine, you figure out what your what intellectual property you have to protect, and figure the way that you're going to protect it." The U.S. government really was not only not helpful, they weren't really paying attention. When we talked to them early on, they'd say, "Well, hey, we hope you do great." One time, I was on a NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory trip, part of DOE, Department of Energy, but NREL had run out of money that year, so they were working with the U.S. EPA to sponsor this trip to China. You may not know this. When you build a wind farm, you want to know what wind patterns are going to be. Do you know where the wind energy got the technology to study wind patterns? From the DoD, from the U.S. Department of Defense. Why? Because the Department of Defense was very interested in plume dispersals. If you blow something up, whether it's chemical or nuclear, you want to know how that plume will disperse. That's what gave rise to learning how to predict wind speeds and directions at given points on the Earth. Well, so I suggested to the EPA sponsor that they actually present the wind study data that the U.S. taxpayer was paying for to U.S. wind developers so that they might be able to compete and win wind farm contracts in China. The EPA guy said, "We're not here to help American companies," which was really disappointing to me as an American taxpayer. So that's really a fantastic question because we could talk about it all night. But anyway, another part to that is that the U.S. government hadn't paid enough attention to what's going on in China. Really, they don't really know what's helpful or not. And so much of what the U.S. was doing, Bill Clinton said, good luck with the internet to the Communist Party. Controlling that will be like nailing Jello to the wall. So, and that is a political statement. It's not a partisan statement. It's just an example of how politicians in the United States have not known how to play China. On that point, real quick, when we bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, I don't know if y'all remember that, but bombs that were U.S. bombs that were delivered by a B-2 that took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, dropped bombs directly on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. We killed 3 Ministry of State Security officers, and Clinton went over to China after that, and he put a check in Jiang Zemin's pocket for $1 million for each life. So he gave Jiang a $3 million check, $1 million for each Chinese life. If I had been driving in Beijing and had run somebody over and killed them, I would have owed their family somewhere between $12,000 and $14,000. So when Clinton went and put a check in Jiang's pocket, he really played that well because Jiang couldn't say anything. He couldn't say, "No, we think Chinese lives are only worth $14,000. Well, here's your change." So the U.S. government's position has changed over time. A lot of it's been based in ignorance, and we still don't know how it's really going to turn out.
I'll put two questions together here in terms of doing business. Lee asked, China is very active commercially with a great number of countries to expand its interests. How will this influence, impact the U.S. China relationship? And then I think, kind of related to that, Alan asks, is it possible to do business in China without having to deal with the Communist Party?
Well, the last part is easy. Right now, it is impossible to do business in China as an American without the Communist Party being involved. The earlier part of the question about China working all over the world and providing financing, I fear that the Communist Party has overstretched the PRCs, or the People's Republic of China, financing with its, right now it's about $5 trillion of investments in the rest of the world. That is will actually create an impairment issue, because the Communist Party will not be able to collect or make money on that $5 trillion of investment. That will make the Communist Party weaker. I don't mind weakening the Communist Party. I want to make sure that Chinese stay strong. If we have a weakening Communist Party, that should mean, or I hope it means, that we've projected more authority to Chinese in China. That will make the world safer. An impaired balance sheet for the Communist Party makes the Communist Party less stable.
Okay. Another business-related question from Ken. From a commercial investment standpoint, is the economic reward of doing business in China, it's the scale of the scale of the Chinese market, is it worth the commercial risk?
It's too early to tell.
Okay.
The U.S. and China are intertwined. The giant redwoods in California, those trees are huge, and their root system is not capable of absorbing nutrients from the soil on their own. They have to have a symbiotic relationship with fungus to be able to pull nutrients into the tree. The U.S. and China are that related right now. I can't remember the percentage of our drugs that depend on Chinese to keep Americans healthy. There are a lot of drugs, from diabetes drugs to even aspirin, or even things like Advil, that really depend on Chinese production for us to be able to stay healthy. We're not going to get away from that.
And then Linda asked, in terms of your personal business experience, do you speak Mandarin, and how did you conduct your negotiations?
I could order Pijo, Baijiu. I could order a lot of things very well in Mandarin, but I could not keep up with the conversations my own. So I always worked with somebody that either a lot of times we have a lawyer that was working for us that would help me. My partner, Emin Jan, is Taiwanese, University of Houston, PhD in physics. So I always had people around me that spoke Chinese. I don't really speak Chinese.
And I'll put these two questions together. Alan asks, who makes up the real leadership within China, especially in the Communist Party? Who's most important? Military leaders, senior Communist Party officials, oligarchs? Who's the real, core of the leadership? And then I might be misreading the name, I'm sorry, but Karen, I think it said, asks, what is the psychological source of, say, the fears that, say, Communist Party leaders might have about the West?
Wow, there's a lot in that question. It's really hard to know from the United States how the power struggles are occurring behind the Chinese curtain, inside the Communist Party. Even Chinese people don't know, and there's what some people call real smoke right now about Communist Party leadership. Xi Jinping has stretched the Communist Party in a lot of ways, and that has made some people in the party very unhappy. It's very likely that he had Li Keqiang poisoned. Li Keqiang was about the number 2 guy in the Communist Party until about 3 years ago, and he retired and should have been going off to green, just retirement pastures, but Xi Jinping may have had him killed. So there's a lot going on that we can't tell until a lot later.
And then kind of what would you say is kind of the psychological origin of their kind of great fear or distrust of the West and the U.S. in general?
I'm not very good at psychology, so I have to turn to systematic differences. The Communist Party fails to generate returns on capital. That's why it always needs to have other external sources of capital. That systematic problem might lead into psychology, but if you're a leader like Xi Jinping, you care more about control than you do about the prosperity of your populace or of your governed population. So when you create that dynamic, an example like the United States that is a younger country, so it's should be subordinate because of age, that is just knocking the ball out of the park on an economy, you look bad. So you have to start doing things that make you look less bad or that disrupt the outfit that's doing good, and that would be the United States. So sorry, I can't really address the psychology. There is cultural history, the Confucian order of thinking that older is superior to younger. Chinese should be superior to Americans. It's tough. I mean, here we start with we the people. When I say we the people, we all have a very quick idea about what I'm talking about what that means. The Communist Party gives the People's Republic of China its constitution, and it ensconces the Communist Party as the leading light of the whole country, and it puts it above the law. So here we're saying nobody's above the law. The Communist Party says it is above the law. That's an existential threat. It's a diametrically oppositional threat. So sorry, I can't address the psychology that well.
No, that's fine. Dave, just 2 questions. What related to that? What is the fundamental source of our conflict with China? And I suppose really we should probably say with the Chinese Communist Party. And what is the long-term goal of the Communist Party and President Xi?
Xi's goal is to stay in power. He's afraid of losing power. He's afraid of himself losing power, and he's afraid of the Communist Party losing power. And how will it lose power? Partly because other countries like the United States, but other democracies around the world that push authority and responsibility for decision and the consequences of decisions, whether they're good or bad, to people, to frontiers, to individuals, to families, to companies. If you push those kinds of responsibilities and authority to the frontiers and away from a central government, those communities that do that around the world prosper, and they create economic strength. And if you have economic strength, then you can create military strength. Xi Jinping is doing everything he can right now to steal as much intellectual property as he can. There's a Department of Justice study that talks about the Communist Party stealing $200 to $600 billion of intellectual property every year. A CIA officer has taken that study and said, knowing the success of espionage operations, If that's the reported number, the real number is about $5 trillion a year. I said, that doesn't make sense. The U.S. Federal budget is about seven and a half trillion. You're talking about $5 trillion. That's too big. He said, Patrick, they don't steal what you earn; they steal what you got.
And maybe just a last question, and also if you want to kind of add any kind of closing, thoughts to leave people with. There's not a name on this one, but it's a good question. And I think always good to try and be optimistic. And I think for us all to remember, there's a huge difference between the Chinese people who just want a nice, good, ordinary life and the Chinese Communist Party. But someone asks, in your opinion, what scenario needs to happen for the U.S. and China to have a more amiable relations in the future?
Oh, that is a really good question. First, the Communist Party could quit stealing our stuff. That would be a really good start. The Communist Party needs to change, but we need to be more aware of how they need to change. We as Americans need to be aware of how we need them to change. And that's really why I wrote the dadgum book, is winning starts with awareness. And winning is not that Americans beat Chinese, it's that we compete together and we don't go into each other's locker room and start messing with gear and poisoning water fountains and things like that. If you're going to compete, but don't go undermining your competitors' capabilities and livelihoods before. Quick story. My dear bride went with me one time to far western China, where we put that first jet engine on the ground, the Western and the Great Wall. And the chairman of the board and I had gotten to know each other fairly well. He was an old line, crusty communist. And one time I got to the board meeting early, because I want to set up my stuff. I've got all my notes, I've got my pencils and my calculator and all that stuff. And I get there early, about 45 minutes early. I walk in, and the only board member that's not there is me. Why? They were having the board meeting that happens before the board meeting, and I walked in on it. Anyway, I was able to talk to the board chair about that, and say that's really not fair, and so we got to where we talked directly to one another, and if we were mad, we said it makes me mad. Well, anyway, at the dinner, Kathy was there with me. I asked him about his family, and he had 2 daughters. Kathy and I have 3, and I said, "Where are they?" And he knew where they were, so which told me that he had kept up with his family through the Cultural Revolution. And I asked him a question about that time. I didn't say the Cultural Revolution, but I asked this old, tough, crusty Communist Party member, chairman of the board of the company that's generating electricity near the Western and the Great Wall, how did he keep his family together then? This guy started to cry. He started crying. I said, something like, it's fascinating to me how history gives us different opportunities. And here I'm younger and I'm not Chinese and I'm far from home, but he sees me as having a privileged life, which I do. The opportunities that my generation has been able to have been incredible. And it's because of people that have gone before us. He didn't have the same opportunities. He had to take his family through the Cultural Revolution. So we need to understand part of, and this gets to the psychology question a little bit maybe, but we need to understand what's happened in their history. And we need to build on that and work forward together.
And lastly, before we close, as Marianne mentioned, we're adding events to our website all the time. We have a lot of things in store that may not be on there yet, but please join us in 2 weeks. We'll be back here again with an excellent journalist from El Salvador, who sadly has had to leave El Salvador himself in the last few weeks, to talk about El Salvador, President Bukele, the crushing of MS-13, which is great, but also maybe the crushing of personal liberties in the country, the mega prisons you might have heard about, some others in the next few weeks. September 4th, very interesting program. We're going to host former Iranian ambassador Syed Mousavian. He was also a former Iranian spokesperson for nuclear negotiations, a very different, unusual perspective. Someone who himself got on the wrong side of some of the more radical elements in the Iranian government. And then September 25th, we're hosting retired Admiral John Kirby, who you might know as spokesperson, Pentagon spokesperson, national security spokesperson, and also a spokesperson of the White House for a number of years, about the outlook for U.S. foreign policy. But again, we have Patrick's excellent book, Dancing with the Dragon. We have it around here on the side, and he's going to stay to sign them, which is great. And I just want to say thank you all again for coming, and we all please join me in thanking Patrick Jenevein. Thank you.